Good morning. Today we're going to be talking about standards-based classrooms and instructional leadership. Both of those things go together, and a lot of times we make this way more complicated than it has to be. To talk about standards-based classrooms, we first need to talk about curriculum, instruction, and assessment. Curriculum is simply what you're going to teach. And a lot of times the state or whatever entity you're working with has already defined your curriculum or what you're going to teach. Your instructional component is simply how you're going to teach it. Now, you have strategies around instruction, you have strategies around curriculum. That's not what we're getting into today. We're not doing curriculum strategies, nor are we doing instructional strategies. And we're not doing assessment strategies either, because that's the third component of your standards-based classroom assessment. And so you have assessment strategies as well. And assessment is simply how the teacher is going to know that the students have mastered the standards. So a standards-based classroom is simply a classroom where curriculum, instruction, and assessment are aligned to the standards that are usually provided by the state or by the feds, if it's Common Core, for example. So now we want to get into instructional leadership and what that looks like and how that ties into standards-based classrooms. And all of this is a process. So to take a picture of something and say, oh, this is a standards-based classroom, you cannot capture a process in a photo. It's a process in dealing with the leadership and dealing with the standards-based instructional practices that teachers are required to do in 2023. So there are three parts to instruction. There's pre-teaching, that's before you teach, the actual teaching, and then there is post-teaching. And there are elements that go along with each of those components of teaching. So let's talk about pre-teaching. And all of these require artifacts, all right, and evidence. And so if you're an instructional leader and you're a principal, then there are certain things that you need to look for as the leader in the building to make sure that your teachers are aware of their standards, number one, and that they are teaching those standards and that students are learning those standards. And there are several components, about 15. Some of them are broken down into more than one piece in that 15, but we're going to go over those now. So pre-teaching is going to require some collaboration. And some of you teach singletons in high school and you don't have anyone to collaborate with, but there's someone at the state level, there's someone at another school. Normally there's someone you can collaborate with, but if there is not anyone you can collaborate with, you still follow these same rules. But a lot of this requires collaboration because the best professional learning you're ever going to get is from other teachers that have already done what you are attempting to do. You can learn from their successes or their defeats and figure out what it is that is best for the students that you're serving in your particular environment, wherever that may be. So collaboratively identify the power standards. Now, a lot of districts have units, and those units are designed to go along with the curriculum. And hopefully they are going along with a pacing chart that suits the requirements for testing at the end of the year. If your units are not aligned, or if you don't have any units, then identifying those power standards, those standards that go throughout the curriculum that are mandatory for students to learn, that will be heavily tested, are required to be identified. So if you have units, you don't have to worry about identifying power standards because that has already been done for you. Hopefully those units are aligned to what needs to take place because you have other assessments in your district a lot of times, and sometimes they are perfectly aligned and the timelines are right and the pacing chart is good, and sometimes it's not the case, and students are learning different things at different times, but they don't have the foundational skills because of a lack of alignment. So you have to monitor that at the district level, talking to district people on that. But for the principals and the teachers, identifying those power standards or utilizing your units. And that's a collaborative effort. You want to collaboratively create curriculum maps with the standard pacing and off-pace modified pacing. So you may have various students in your classroom. Some of them will require more attention than others. Some of them won't go as far in depth as others because of their identification or their learning style or their learning speed. So you have to have those off-pace modified curriculums within the curriculum in your classrooms. And this gets easier over time. You have to individually or collaboratively study and know your content, your vocabulary, and skills presented by the standards and elements. You need to know your vocabulary because you are imparting the vocabulary and utilizing that vocabulary within your lessons. You need to individually and collaboratively read through your standards and the associated elements. You can't teach without reading through your standards and your elements and knowing what's coming next and how you need to combine and how you need to push through some things and just things you might need to brush up on in order to explain to students. You want to make appropriate connections and about thinking and possible combinations of thinking as it pertains to your standards and your elements. You want to read through the appropriate sections in the textbook or on the computer so that you can match the curriculum and your learning and your teaching together for students to make it easy. You want to review your resources and review your content descriptors if they're applicable for the standards and elements you're teaching. You want to identify and weave vocabulary into the lesson and referring to those vocabulary terms often with the students. Please use the vocabulary of the standards. And you want to recognize the importance of acquiring vocabulary as it relates to student learning. You also want to collaboratively match the levels of cognition with the standard and the element. What does that mean? That means the methods that you're using to teach need to be at the same level of rigor and cognition as the intent of the standard. I won't repeat that. Collaboratively organized to teach in ascending order or in order of cognitive rigor and relevance, and discuss and recommend a progressive level of questioning. Questioning in the classroom is important for you to formatively assess where your students are at any given moment. Collaboratively create essential and daily focus questions. Collaboratively create summative assessments. Collaboratively create formative assessments. Collaboratively select appropriate instructional strategies. Not too many instructional strategies for a lesson. 3 would probably be the max. If you could squeeze out with 2, that would be great. But anything more than 3 is going to cause you problems. And if you need more instructional strategies, you're going to reserve that for MTSS or RTI purposes. That's when you're going to differentiate your instruction. Collaboratively place into the required planning format. You got to turn your lesson plans in. However that looks, make sure your lesson plans are in to the principal because that's what they're going to use as their guideline as they come to review your lesson. And provide it to your classroom guests and collaboratively prepare or select a lesson document, artifacts, including rubrics, and provide those to the guests of your classroom as well. All right, that's pre-teaching. You hadn't even taught yet, right? So if you get your pre-teaching right, it makes your teaching so much easier. And your day is just going to be smooth. But the pre-teaching is where the teachers struggle. because it shows during your teaching, and then your evaluation isn't where you want it to be, and then you have an issue with the principal because you didn't do what you were supposed to do. Or maybe the principal's been not monitoring the pre-teaching. Anyway, it comes out either way during the teaching, which is when most of you are monitored. And you're monitored by other administrators from the district, from the principal. But if I were you, teachers, I would do some peer observations, allow other teachers to come in, or you go in and, go into other teachers' classrooms. You can also videotape your lessons. Some of you are doing that already. Some of you have instructional coaches where you can provide modeling sessions and then just coaching overall. So let's talk about teaching. So you teach your students by can't say it, and I'm not going to edit. Conspicuously, there you go, posting standards and elements in the classroom in a place that is readily seen and accessible. People do that all the time. And you're going to connect to prior standards or the current essential question. I read that out of my book. I got a book, y'all. It's on page 54. Turnaround Principles for Turnaround Principles. But anyway, conspicuously posting and stating the EQ and referencing it during the lesson using the vocabulary of the standard. You want to unwrap the standard. You want to post your focus questions if you have those. You want to present vocabulary and context during the lesson. It's also important to interpret your vocabulary. If students are coming from an environment where this word just sounds strange, put it into terms that they understand and then give them the formal term of the standard. And then you want to open the lesson and teach the acquisition lesson using cognitively appropriate best practice strategies. You want to teach and use scaffolding for your students. So bridge from one lesson to the next, show how it relates, and fully develop the lesson and concepts being presented to the level of rigor required by the verb in the standard. You got to pay attention to the verbs in the standard because they tell you what type of work needs to be done by the students and what preparation needs to take place by the teacher. Making relevant real-world connections, conducting many summary checks every 15 minutes. The teacher needs to, that's just a rough timeline. Teacher needs to check to make sure students have understanding. Formative assessment. You want to close your lesson, of course. You want to reteach and reinforce if necessary. That's based on assessment. You can tell if students are struggling or not based on their assessment results, formative or summative. And you want to summatively assess students to determine their mastery overall. If there is no mastery, then you certainly want to reteach. And if there is mastery, then you want to move on when your students are learning at approximately 80%. That's a good bar. When 80% of your class got it, it's pretty safe to move on. You may be able to squeeze 75% based on the time that you have to teach a lesson and get things done based on what's left in your curriculum. But 80% is your good target. That is teaching. Now notice I'm not providing notes. I'm not writing any of this stuff down for you. Like I said, it's in the book. And hopefully you're paying attention. Just go back, watch the video. When you have interviews for positions and they ask you about standards-based classrooms and instructional leadership, all of these components need to be discussed. But you cannot put everything within that 10-minute interview. So you need to pick and choose what you're going to be discussing when you talk about these things during an interview. And I know I'm getting sidetracked on the interview process, but just keep that in mind. Lastly, post-teaching. Collaboratively plan to give feedback for the common assessment, summative assessment within 2 to 3 days. Don't keep students waiting too long. Give feedback to your students. Collaboratively discuss the best use of data to reteach and which strategy you're going to use for your response to intervention, your RTI, your MTSS, at the cognitive level required. And lastly, communicate summative results within that 2 to 3 day window. and then weigh the need for mastery versus the need to move on. Sometimes you just have to move on, just depending on what your goals are for the year and what your curriculum requires to be successful in the assessment at the end of the year via standardized testing. Anyway, that was 15 minutes and 20 seconds. We're out. My name is Kwame Carr, Accuratics LLC.